Singularity. My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoyed this podcast, you can show your support by writing a brief review on iTunes or by simply becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. My guest today is Dr. Eve Poole. Dr. Poole is a theologian, leadership scholar, and author whose work bridges ethics, neuroscience, capitalism, and emerging tech. She holds a PhD from Cambridge, taught leadership for 15 years, and has advised leaders across government, finance, education, and the Church of England. Her latest book, Robot Souls, Programming in Humanity, claims that our so-called junk code, that is to say our emotion, intuition, story, and even our mistakes, is the missing ingredient in how we design AI and the key to preserving what makes us human. In this conversation, I want to explore what it means to program humanity into our machines and how we can reclaim our wisdom, meaning, and responsibility in an age of artificial intelligence. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Eve.
Hello, great to be here.
Fantastic. So, I just introduced you, but if I were to meet you somewhere in a coffee shop in Edinburgh, where you are right now, by the way, one of my favorite cities, how would you introduce yourself to a stranger in a sentence or two?
I think I'd be very British and sort of shuffle my feet and apologize a lot. But I finally would say that I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, I also am a leader. And I do all of those things in a variety of ways. And I suppose, like you, I'm curious. So an awful lot of the things you've mentioned about research and books have been because whenever I come up against something that puzzles me or makes me cross, I have to write a book about it so I know what I think.
Wonderful. Well, when it comes to apologizing, no one beats the Canadians here. So I'm impressed that you're putting the British in the same group too, but I guess we all perceive ourselves in an interesting way, which kind of leads us perhaps to whether or not robots actually are a reflection of our humanity.
Well, they are, in that we have designed them to be so. I suppose the argument of my book is to say we've made a real hash of that copying because we've sort of drunk the Kool-Aid about what we think is human based on, what we learned in the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and what seems to be trendy right now about, the rational mind. So we sort of top-sliced things that we're not ashamed of and that we're very clear about and decided that they're the prototype and that's what we're going to copy into artificial intelligence. So insofar as we're imagining we're creating our best selves in AI and robotics, then I think that's true. And I guess the argument of my book is that that is true to a degree, but it's also fairly terminal if that's all we think we are.
Wow. So first, you're answering my question really well, but also you're answering my consequent question about the thesis in your book. But let's break it down here step by step. So in a way, what you're saying is that we're aiming to create robots as a perfected version of our own selves, where we have enhanced and amplified our strengths or perceived strengths, such as, logic and reasoning and so on, and where we delete the code pertaining to our flaws or not even introduce it. And that mainly being, our emotions, our intuition, maybe what some people have referred to as our soul, or at the very least, our consciousness. Is that kind of like the gist of your argument here?
Absolutely. I think it's very aspirational. And I think that's what's difficult about it, because it is a noble idea that we should absolutely copy only the best of ourselves, because why would we include things that we think are wrong or broken or flaws or problematic. But I think when you start unpacking what it is we're about, the design flaws sort of set in a long time ago. So if you think even about that idea of rational thought, if you think about where that came from, it's quite a specific philosophical concept. It's probably Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan talking about a train of thought and thought as computation. And the rot set in there, really, because we decided that, well, if all we're doing in our heads is a train of thought, then easy, because we've got a beginning, a middle, of an end. And that's the sort of thing you can turn into a process and copy. And if that's all you think a human thought is, then, why can't we just, of course, have artificial intelligence? Because it would just be copying a whole load of these thoughts sequentially. And that should be an easy thing to do. But of course, anyone who's ever had a thought knows you might be in that coffee shop and someone says, "Who are you?" And everything's going in your head like, when is my coffee ready? Do I like this person? Have I remembered my shopping? Oh, it's raining and I didn't have an umbrella, as well as all the other things. You're not just having our train of thought, you're having loads of thoughts and sensations and feelings all at the same time. So in some ways, we were never going to get it right if that's all you think a human thought is, let alone all the other things that we're very preoccupied about trying to copy into AI. That idea of rational thought is just one of the very many things where we are hoping that we're all really rational and that that's the best of us, and therefore we have taken that bit out to copy and optimize in AI.
Yeah, I think probably not just Hobbes who claimed that thinking was computation, but maybe my favorite, or one of my favorite guys, Plato, bears some responsibility about that kind of valuing reason and rationality over and above our, quote, female or feminine parts, which are emotion and attachment and intuition and things like that, and going towards our so-called masculine parts, which are supposedly the higher parts. So that's the part that, he's not so favorite of mine on, but he does bear some responsibility for that kind of reasoning, which actually...
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that's also true in an awful lot of particularly Western philosophy, that for years it was all about objective rational thought. I mean, it's not just cogito ergo sum, it's everybody thinking that thought is something out there that is sort of scientific and analyzable and quite clean. And it's only when you get into the more sort of embedded subjective philosophy that things start getting messier. So you're absolutely right, it's not just Hobbes.
Yeah. There's thousands of years of that kind of thinking. And my favorite philosophical school, the Stoics, actually talk a lot about that. I would argue in a good way. But let me backtrack just a little bit and zoom out, because you have a theology PhD from Cambridge. You have an MBA before that too. You've worked in the financial industry as a consultant. So how does someone with your background end up writing a book about robots and AI? That's kind of strange to me. Is there
I love that question.
Specific occurrence or a story or a moment of realization or inspiration, something pushed you towards it? How did it happen? It's very strange.
Well, I think it is all part of the same piece, really. And again, something a robot wouldn't sort of write as a sort of rational progression, I suppose. But the theology degree and working for my graduate job in the Church of England, then doing the MBA and working in the city for Deloitte, made me very curious about capitalism, the system running underneath so much of Western society in particular. And when I was feeling that capitalism was breaking down, it felt to me as though theology would be the right doorway to try and understand where it was going wrong, because, of course, most of formal modern capitalist thought emerged in the 18th century when Judeo-Christian religion was generally in ascendancy, and most people had that as a worldview. So I think that's relevant because most of the AIs we have are in the hands of private corporations in a capitalist system. So they're very much authored by that system, really. So having written that, that was what the PhD was about. It's theology and capitalism. So I've written quite a lot on that. I was also teaching leadership at a business school, which makes you very curious about humans. I'm very interested in character development. I chaired a school, very famous school in Scotland called Gordonston, which specialises in that. So there were a lot of things coming together for me. There was something about the system in which we're operating. There was something about the people who are trying to lead within that system. And then there was something quite devastating about the teleology. So I'm very used to working in very secular spaces like business schools and many corporations. But of course, I have a background in theology, so I have that as a worldview. And it was occurring to me that this kind of mad dash towards rationality, materialism, secularism, atheism, all of those kinds of philosophies of life, has at its heart this idea that, evolution sort of set us off and we're keeping going. And whether it's the selfish gene or adaptation or whatever you want to talk about, we're constantly improving, albeit quite slowly, because it takes us a while to sort of die off and be replaced and all those kinds of things. But there is a sort of teleology within that, which is about gradual improvement and, I suppose, perfection. And I kept coming up against people who genuinely would argue that if the goal of evolution is perfection, and AI is handing you the ability to speed that up, then why are we not absolutely investing everything we have in AI in order to hand over the species to AI who will perfect us? And then we can all just push off as a species and die, because the species has been rubbish. We've despoiled the planet. We keep fighting each other. We're completely rubbish, and therefore we don't deserve to survive. If we could really copy ourselves, the best bits of ourselves, would that not be the best legacies to create a master race of what we could have been like if we weren't so broken and dreadful? And then that would be the peak of evolution as a teleology. And I suppose it was that made me write my book on robot souls, because having a theological background, I have a view that we have been made by a divine power, and in my particular Christian tradition, made in the image of God. And if you believe anything like that, if you believe that we were created, no matter which god or gods or anything you think by, and it's not just about evolution, then presumably there is something quite precious and special and thoughtful and good about that design. It can't just be completely broken and worthy of extinction. And that's what made me go back into the weeds to say, well, what is this design then? Which is when I started noticing how badly we were copying ourselves.
Wow. There's so many things I want to grab in there that I don't even know where to begin. And the word teleology is kind of a crucial word for me, because for the last maybe 10 years, I've been using it as a bad word in my podcasts. Well, you know what? Maybe that's what we should grab. So, Ray Kurzweil is very liable to a teleological criticism, in the sense that his book, The Singularity is Near, as well as his book, The Singularity is Nearer, but especially the first one, have this kind of I think it was a 7-step teleological progression or evolution, cosmic evolution, where we go from no intelligence to life to, human or biological intelligence, then eventually artificial intelligence, and the ultimate stage of that kind of evolution is, the universe wakes up until the moment where there is no such thing as stupid matter left in the universe, but everything becomes smart, including the dust. So we end up with a smart universe, giant computronians, smart dust, and the universe wakes up, as he says. And to me, at certain point, that became a kind of I don't want to say neo-Christian, but certainly neo-religious, teleological view that was basically taken from our previous theology and imported into our technological, I don't want to say evolution, but perception or conception, so that we see the world in a new way, but actually it's the same as before. And in my eyes, to my view, as someone who doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe that there is a telos for humanity. And by the way, telos is a word invented by one of my other favorite guys, Aristotle, and his idea, just for the sake of our audience who may have not seen my previous episodes on that topic, is the idea of a telos is basically, imagine a knife. The telos of a knife is to cut. And so a knife that is dull fails to fulfill its own telos and therefore is a bad knife. That's how you judge a knife. You judge a knife with respect to whether it's able to fulfill its telos or not. And a good knife would be a sharp knife because it is able to fulfill its purpose. Likewise, if we take that idea of a telos and now move it to humanity in general, or even more so to the universe, as Ray Kurzweil has done, then that would appear that there is a kind of a direction, first to what is a good human or a bad human, teleologically speaking, in terms of a predetermined purpose we all must fulfill, and then even more so for the cosmos or the universe that we live in. And to me, those are kind of a very big claims that I don't see any evidence in support of. But what's interesting to me is that you come from a theological background, and yet you've noticed the same things, and kind of in a way you're criticizing them. Am I correct?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is to do with on what level do you think you should be looking for telos, because there's something about what would the culmination of the universe be or mean, should that even be a meaningful concept, all the way down to what's the future of the planet, what's the future of our species on the planet. And I suppose I was picking up that there was a very defendable and defensible notion that human perfection was about intellectual perfection. So AI would help us become the most perfect version of ourselves. That would be the sharp knife in that context. And while I've spent a lot of my time in universities and writing books and things, I love the intellect, I sort of thought that there were a number of reasons why we've prioritized IQ or intelligence as being the kind of primary facet, goal, privilege of humans. I don't know. And I was a bit suspicious about that, partly because it is only a particular sort of intelligence, and partly because I think there are historical reasons why we copy minds and not bodies. So if you think about what we learnt in Europe in the Second World War about eugenics, we were very, very worried when we heard that there was an idea that you could breed master races. It's not a new concept, of course, in time, in the universe, but it is a troubling one. And there have been a whole load of concerns through time and through communities about it not being quite right to decide there is one best model of a person that you should breed for, even though, of course, we freely do that with animals and crops and all kinds of other stuff, because we felt that was sort of crossing a line. So I think the reason we stopped copying bodies in terms of artificial bodies and have a lot of ethical lines about that is because we could see the immorality of that. We could see that was deeply troubling. But because we thought thoughts were just a sort of interesting intellectual activity out there somewhere, we sort of didn't think it was morally salient to worry about copying them. We just thought, oh, that's frightfully logical. We'll all be really brilliant and intelligent and hooray, philosophy. But actually, when you start looking at that in the round, you start realizing not only is it a misunderstanding of humanity, it is a very dangerous assumption based on some quite partial thinking, which is only ever going to get you to design something that is already broken.
Mm-hmm. Well, like last time, there's so many things I want to grab here. It's so interesting, but just clarify a little further for me, if you please, and maybe say more. We're both kind of critical to the teleology of Silicon Valley in general, perhaps I should say, the idea that we're moving, cosmologically speaking, from less towards more intelligence. and specifically as represented by Ray Kurzweil, most famously than anyone else that I know of. I come from a kind of an atheistic point of view, which is what I find so interesting. You come critical also from a kind of a Christian believer theological point of view. Tell me more about that. How do we find each other, ourselves, allies on this? This is so interesting to me.
Well, I think they are the same thought, really, which is that whether or not you think God designed us or the universe did at some level, it is obvious that as a species we have been successful enough to have survived till this very day. So, in spite of the fact we know that we're a dreadful species, we're still here. So, there's obviously something that is working about human design. And so this idea that we're all flawed and it's a disaster and we all ought to become extinct in preference to AI, I just don't get that. And I wasn't seeing anyone standing up and fighting for humans. I wasn't seeing anyone saying, well, we deserve to live. There's a point to us. We're valuable and important. And again, I know that's kind of speciesist in a way. And I mean, why should humans be so special? But I sort of thought at least one human has to get up and say, well, I think we are. And whether you think that's because God made us in God's image, or whether you just think we're not done yet as a design. The design has got some space to run. And actually, if we understood it better, we might understand why it is so sticky in a way that AI won't be if we don't redesign it, because it's badly designed. It's copying only partial bits of what was a very successful design, and it's not copying all the bits that have allowed us to stay successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. Before we jump into the details about why and if and how this is to be done, let's just kind of define our terms a little bit, because, I don't talk to theology. Let me just backtrack a little and share with you. The reason why I invited you to this podcast is two reasons, actually. One is a fan of my podcast, Nick's Good, actually recommended you, and I always try to listen to my audience. But another reason is that you have a very interesting and diverse background, which I found kind of paradoxical. Theology, Masters of Business Administration, business consulting, capitalism, and then on top of it, AI and robots. And then on top of it, I actually read your book and I found it very good. It's short, but it's very dense in the way that it shows a very wide and good depth and breadth of your knowledge on the topic, which was impressive to me. And it was very well written, so I enjoyed it. And so those were the reasons I wanted to bring you in here. But now we find ourselves allies in a kind of in a strange way. But let's then get that kind of diversity of your background so that it can help us define our terms here, which are the main terms. And the first thing is, what is human?
I think that is a really, really hard question to answer. And you'll know from reading my book that I wrestle quite hard with this, because actually, if you read the Human Rights Act, if you read the compact that has been taken up by so many nations globally about protecting humans, there is no definition of human in there. It's just assumed that we're making the laws. Obviously, we know what human is. What's your problem? But of course, if you start delving into case law all over the world about what is a human, you'll get some idea from some of those red lines I talked about, from embryology, from cloning, from experimentation, from the rights of the non-verbal and the minor and the disabled and the all those kinds of things. We sort of end up crowding around a set of circumstances that we would call human. But as soon as you try and define it around DNA or around capacities, you immediately fall foul of a whole load of other things that you need to take into account. So I'm really fascinated by this, because if you think about our protections in law, should there be a time, which may not be very far away, where we have to defend ourselves against an AI in court about who deserves what sort of treatment? How would we argue that we are more human than an AI? And one of the things that is really interesting is if you start looking around the world at all the ways in which humans are protected in law, normally the people who wrote those laws were religious people, just again because of the history of most of our formalizations of these ways of living. And actually, what is being assumed as the definition of human is a human soul. And because every human has a soul, and again, a philosophical concept as well as a religious one, there is a sense that every soul has a dignity and attracts a dignity and attracts a set of rights and protections by definition. It doesn't matter if you're a clever one, a broken one, a young one, um, from a different part of the country, or any of those things. It is your ensoulment that seems to attract the protections of being human. And I'm really interested in that because I do think that is probably something that, whether or not you can really define it, is something which you can't manufacture. So I suspect we can't bestow souls on robots and AIs. But I think it is a really good question because if you start saying, well, humans are the people making the laws, then what happens if the white mice or the rabbits or the octopuses get really good at making laws? Who wins? What happens if an alien race comes and they're better than us? So you start getting into some really shady territory about who's on top these days, because it's always been humans for years now, because we've got the technology to outwit all the other apex predators like sharks and tigers and things. And we imagined that was because we were the most intelligent. The problem is we're probably not now the most intelligent thing. We may be the most intelligent species, but for how long can we defend that territory? So I think that is the $1 million question. What is human? And in my junk code thesis, I'm arguing something that's very distinctive, because I think for me they're hallmarks of soul. Even if you can't really say, what is the source code, what is soul exactly, you can kind of guess by a few of these hallmarks and footprints things that souls tend to do, this junk code stuff, which I think is the nearest I've managed to get to defining what is human.
So in other words, your claim here is that a human is a being with a soul, ensouled
Yes.
being. So then we're kind of like really sort of like avoiding the answer by creating a new concept. So we're going to have to define that new concept. Okay, so what is a soul then?
Well, that's again, you'll see there's vast tracts in my book about what is the soul, what is consciousness. I think a lot of people would prefer to talk about consciousness because it doesn't feel like it's a religiously laden concept.
Just to open a bracket here as a side joke, when I was a sort of like up in your face philosophy student, undergrad, I would give hard time to my psychology colleagues by, first of all, asking them if they knew who coined the term psychology. And of course, most of them had no clue that it was our previously mentioned friend Aristotle. And of course, psychology means a science or a study of the soul. So then my consequent question was like, okay, how do you study scientifically that which scientifically has not been proven to exist? In other words, your whole field is like BS.
Yeah, what?
Like it's totally like almost a tautological inconsistency or some kind of like a strange phenomenon, and they found that, my colleagues used to find that extremely annoying. So how do we...
It is very hard, though. It's very hard because, here's an example. We were talking about my very strange background. So I found myself giving a talk on AI to all of the Church of England bishops. So it was a room of about 100 bishops and archbishops, and they obviously lead the Church of England. And in the Christian tradition, there is a ritual called baptism when you welcome often a baby, but sometimes an adult or another child into the family of God. And so it's a particular ritual, a sacrament where you're essentially baptizing a soul. So I asked
I've
them a
been
question.
baptized.
There you go. So you're secretly one of us. So I asked them the question. I said, well, we've heard about, the telescope identification of chromatological residue that could potentially mean life on other planets, and we keep hearing about a rock from Mars, and so maybe if we can master space-time continuum light years, an alien might show up next week in your church. Now, would you baptize an alien? And generally they would, because they think, well, God made the aliens because God made all the planets and God made all the world. So God made an alien. And then there was a bit of a conversation about, well, what sort of alien? If it's a nice alien like, Yoda, we have no problem with baptizing Yoda because Yoda's very wise and can chat. But if it's one of those sort of green blobs that can't really communicate and we're a bit scared of, then I'm not sure how we'd baptize one of them. So you sort of get a qualified yes. So then the next sequence is to say, well, look, would you baptize an octopus? Because again, there is this idea that intelligence is important and createdness is important and being organic or something. And they definitely wouldn't baptize an octopus. They have to do pet blessing services, but they would never baptize an animal. They were sort of maybe persuadable about some animals that we kind of like and we think are probably quite intelligent, but definitely not things like spiders or things that were snakes and things like that. So again, very interesting thought process about the extent to which an animal might have a soul, but not enough of a soul to be baptized. So then I said, well, okay, if I brought my clone to talk to you tonight, someone I'd built in a lab earlier today, would you baptize them? They're like, yes, no problem. I said, well, I think that's completely awful because I was just grown in a lab yesterday. There's nothing Eve-ish about me. I'm just a sort of copy of myself. And they said, well, technically you've already been baptized, so presumably your cloned soul is a baptized soul. And so we got into some very shady territory about createdness. And then I said, well, would you baptize an AI? And of course, they wouldn't baptize anything like ChatGPT. They're not very keen on algorithms. But when you start talking about, data from Star Trek and Android type AIs, they're like, well, and so you start getting into some really interesting evidence of what people really think soul means, because it seems to be wrapped up in some pretty ordinary thinking about whether we're organic, whether we're intelligent, who created us, whether we can communicate, all kinds of things that don't actually stand up to scrutiny. So I think possibly it's easier for people to talk about consciousness because it seems more obvious that something has consciousness or not. Even that is in dispute at the moment because we're finding rights regimes all over the world having recognized generally humans, often animals, certainly corporations. They're now recognizing, rivers, trees, mountains, all these other kinds of things. And again, whether you think a mountain has consciousness in the same way that a tree or an octopus or a person might, is something people are starting to get more interested in. So this whole thing, when you talked about smart dust, that I think is a concept that is much more talking about consciousness than it's talking about soul. And that might be an easier way to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. So, in short, your answer of defining what is human is to say that it's a being with a soul. And then when we talked about what is a soul, you're saying, well, the closest we can get to defining that is to say it's consciousness.
And in particular, in terms of human consciousness rather than the consciousness of any other created, then I would say it's all the junk code. It's the junk code that defines us as human.
Very interesting. Okay, so maybe now is the time to talk about what is the junk code? How do we differentiate between the different parts of the junk code, which could be self-awareness, consciousness, or if you come from a religious background, the soul, as three different parts or representations of that junk code, maybe intuition, and why the hell do they matter now more than ever? I mean, look, ChatGPT is doing some pretty incredible stuff already, And as far as we know, it's not self-conscious and it doesn't have a soul, in my opinion. Uh, I mean, I mean, feel free to disagree on any of those with me, but it's doing pretty incredible stuff already. So why
Yeah.
in the world would we start actually putting those things now when it's been so useful not to have them?
Yeah. So, two things. I'll come back to the idea of would we need to program these things in, because that's the subtitle of my book, Programming in Humanity, and talk about what it is first that we would consider programming in. So, I mentioned my excursion on this, which is no one was fighting for humans. There seemed to be this teleology of perfection, and we also seem to have top sliced some sort of partial but sort of fancy bits of us around rationality and science and things like that, to the detriment of everything else. And of course, as a theologian, I'm going to hate that anyway, because I'm not loving science and zeros and ones and things. So I'm always noticing that kind of bias, if you like. Because an awful lot of my life has been about the grey areas and all the other things. And so whenever they're being airbrushed out, I'm always suspicious. So I guess because I'm suspicious and because I do have this religious belief that we must be beautifully made and perfectly designed for God's ends, whatever they may be, I thought, well, we need to try and figure out what our design is then. And what was odd is when I sat down to try and puzzle that out, and I got into my what does it really mean to be human and how do you actually define a human and all those kinds of conversations, I started noticing that a way to answer the question was to kind of do it the wrong way around, by asking, what have we not coded into AI? What have we not copied? And have a look at that. So that's why I discovered the junk code, because there seemed to be a load of stuff that we'd left out because we were a bit embarrassed about it. And it sort of had the appearance of kind of flaws in our design and stuff that was, ill considered or ill defined or certainly not readily programmable and possibly not useful. So, like any sort of junk code, we've just ignored it and hoped that, there's nothing very crucial about it.
But maybe there's a big or good reason why that would be the case. And for example, the most comical representation for me is one of my all-time most favorite books, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Douglas Adams has my favorite robot of all time, Marvin, who is kind of a little bit manic, depressive type of a guy. And the question that his case rises, at least for me, is like, why do we need consciousness or even a soul, let alone, when we just need to get certain task accomplished? Why do you need a self-conscious escalator or, an elevator or what have you? And aren't those machines and or robots or AI or ChatGPT just a little bit more sophisticated and complicated, like self-driving cars or what have you? Aren't they just good enough without all those parts? Isn't that the whole reason?
Well, I think we're probably conflating a couple of things there. I mean, I think that's right. I don't think we should automatically think that everything AI-ish ought to have all functionality that we can possibly throw at it, because we're all guilty of using AI very generically, and it can cover a whole range of different sorts of technologies. But if you look at the junk code, there's a sort of logic to it that seems to be implicated in our survival as a species. And that made me concerned. So just an example, before I get into defining the junk code, if you think about species that have generally survived across the universe in general, they tend to be very diverse. And that is obviously a hedge because it spreads risk. And if one country is obliterated or one type of DNA is vulnerable, there is enough in the species that is different from that you can evolve away from that problem and the species survives, whether you're talking about plants or fungus or people or rabbits. There's something about diversity that's very crucial. The interesting thing about capitalism is that the models tend to be going for monopoly of some kind. And AGI as a concept is also trying to come up with one superhuman design for artificial general intelligence, which we know from an evolutionary point of view is incredibly foolish, because if you only have one design, the second a virus comes, it'll be wiped out. So it's not resilient. So that was a sort of general meta observation, which is we are designing stuff that is too homogeneous to be safe. And we know that from all the LLMs. Whenever they analyze them to try and figure out why is one better than the other, there's very little that's different about them in terms of data sets, or, there's some slightly different things around the power behind them and whatever. But they're not radically different, although, you can program slightly different things into them. And that in and of itself is a sort of design flaw, if you like, given what we know about the resilience of many species. So when I started thinking about that, I started thinking, well, look, imagine you are God or the universe or whoever was in charge of this emergence of a human, and you're trying to figure out a good design. The first thing you notice is that you have decided that this species is going to have free will. And free will is a really, really bad design choice unless you also have a species that is omniscient. Because having free will without complete knowledge of everything ever would make you prone to making errors and mistakes that could be the end of your species, and then you've wasted a very good design. So the second you start talking about free will, you have to start adding in lots of sort of amelioration to de-risk your species. So the first thing we do with humans, for example, is we notice that it takes 9 months to grow one. It's a very long gestation period. And then when they are born, they're very vulnerable for really quite a lot of years. So you need to have some mechanism whereby that baby is going to be grown, birthed, and taken care of until it becomes a mature adult. And what we do in our design is we have a functionality that we would know as emotions, which makes us interested in pregnancies, meeting each other, being godparents, being grandparents, being siblings, all of those kinds of emotional bonds, loyalty, all the negative things as well as the positive things that tend to bond us together, which mean that you immediately get safety in numbers, because in the way that they say it takes a village to raise a child, you will have an awful lot of people who are vulnerable in your community. And unless you have emotions and you have kith and kin, you won't have safety in numbers in order to protect the species at its most vulnerable. So you have free will and you have emotions. And then until your children have grown and been educated and have get something, towards omniscience, at least at a basic level, they may be in situations where they don't know the answer. They're in a data poor environment, they're in danger. So we have this amazing capacity that we would call intuition or sixth sense, or feeling it in your gut, feeling it in your bones, spidey sense. Every language has a different terminology for this kind of way of knowing that we're all quite sure about. We don't really know where it comes from, but particularly when we're little, we immediately know that we don't trust someone. We immediately know we're in danger. There are lots of feelings we have that come from somewhere that we trust, that help keep us safe in situations where we don't really know what the right answer is. So you have emotions and intuition, particularly for when you're very young and vulnerable. And then we have these very interesting junk code mechanisms for this problem of mistake making. So before you even make a mistake, humans have this extraordinary capacity for uncertainty. We're very good at considering paradox, considering opposites, holding off and thinking about A, B, and C and potential consequences. We might, even if we're uncertain about something, ask someone who is wiser than us or does know more. So the function of uncertainty in our design is actually to improve the quality of any decision we do eventually make by making us pause. So it's like a gigantic pause button to de-risk our decisions. But then, of course, we will make the odd mistake. And what's interesting is we learn a lot from mistakes, and AI knows this, which is why they use reinforcement learning. So they've programmed that in already, that bit, because they know, in the same way that you see children learning how to walk through trial and error, falling down and pulling themselves up again, that mistake making is a really important ratchet on our progress and improvement in terms of learning. What they haven't programmed in is another thing that happens in human design when you make a mistake, which is because of the emotions and the intuition, particularly when you make a mistake that people know about, you will get reactions from them. Either you intuit or that you actually feel, because they might shout at you, they might have bad body language, they might ignore you, they might get violent, they might abandon you. All these dangerous things for vulnerable people that make you think, well, that wasn't a helpful thing to have done in terms of my longevity and acceptability. So next time I won't make that mistake. And so we develop over time conscience. And conscience, again, is about de-risking decisions over time by making us get better at making better quality decisions, particularly decisions that will help us in community. So then we have another couple of things. So if you have made a mistake and you're feeling miserable about it and everyone hates you, how do you get out of bed? How do you get up and how do you motivate yourself to keep going? And again, humans have this extraordinary capacity for meaning making. And we will see two dots and make a line. We'll look up at the sky and give the constellations names. We'll get into an elevator in New York and notice it doesn't have a floor 13 because we've made a story up about what 13 means. There's loads of ways in which we just slap meaning on things all the time as humans. And that's really interesting because that drives purpose. Meaning making drives purpose. So we will get out of bed in the morning. We will try harder. We will bounce back because we want to be reliable, friendly, good parents, good colleagues, lovable, whatever those things might be. That sense of purpose drives us forward. And then what we do to future-proof the whole species is we turn all of that into our superpower, which is storytelling. So we tell the most extraordinary stories, and we have been doing. I mean, if you think about the wisdom traditions, we have been saving stories for 2, 3, 4,000 years now. We've been saving all the same stories, actually, globally. They're pretty similar. The patterns, the plots, they talk about 7 basic plots, are not very different. And actually, when you think about the function of storytelling, it's actually a clever way of our ancestors sneaking moral advice in. And so it's sort of wisdom through the centuries being passed on, again, to try and keep the species going in perpetuity. So when you look at all of that stuff, you'd sack a robot for intuition and, starting to go into storytelling, Marvin accepted. But there is something really interesting about the effect of that junk code is to drive us into community so we get safety in numbers so that we survive as a species over the long term. And that absolutely flies in the face of the very individualistic capitalist model behind Silicon Valley and AI globally, which is all about one super design, never sharing, never talking, never communicating, one function, all those kinds of things. So apart from the detail of the junk code, there is something about the whole concept which is missing from AI that would make me worry about AI's longevity.
There's so many interesting things that you just mentioned here, by the way. So as a side note, perhaps I should mention that for me, one of the ways I define human is that we are the meaning-making species. So that's what makes us unique, in my opinion. Not the fact that we have souls, because I don't know even what that means or how to define it. Not even consciousness, because we share that with many other species, in my opinion. But the meaning-making capacity, even need, if you will, I would say it's not just capacity, it's an outright need. We can't help it. We have to make meaning out of things which may or may not have meaning. But if they do, we have a very contextualized meaning as per what do they mean for us. And hence comes your claim, which I can see the logic of, which is to say that this kind of a feature makes us learn from our mistakes in the long run, take better decisions in the long run, and survive or have higher chances of survival in the long run, which is one way of sort of adaptation towards an ever-changing environment and improving the chances of survival. We've talked about the souls or consciousness as potentially or perhaps sort of like interchangeable concepts, where consciousness is a much easier to swallow for many of us rather than the soul. And in the kind of Silicon Valley neuroscience technological realm, the most common opinion is that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. Where do you stand on that idea, and how does it relate to embodying robots with consciousness, or the general thesis of your book?
That's such a brilliant question. I mean, I think I loved your opening about smart dust, by the way, because there is one version of emergentism, which is that matter emerged from consciousness, and matter may or may not last, but consciousness is the universe, and therefore we're drawing to and from that. But most people, particularly in Silicon Valley, would imagine that consciousness as a human property emerged at the point at which our brains became so complicated they needed consciousness in order to be able to process well. Um, and so that would suggest that when AI has reached a threshold of complexity, particularly if you're talking about AGI, then consciousness would spontaneously emerge. And that, I think, has been the kind of working assumption. But I don't think I believe that anymore, because one of the reasons I sat down and finally wrote this book was because I'd watched something on a documentary that was happening in Hod Lipson's lab in Colombia. And he had decided to prototype a very basic robot with a very basic sort of AI to see the extent to which a robot could learn from scratch. And the kind of design problem they were facing was, what happens if you've got to design a Mars rover and you spent billions of dollars on it and you send it up to Mars and a meteor knocks out its leg the very next day? Because you can't send a team of people up to fix it, it's too far away. So you're going to need to design something that you can send to Mars that could fix itself. If something went wrong, it could reprogram itself, it could still fulfill its mission. So they decided in a very basic way to build something which looked a bit like Thing from the Addams Family. It's just sort of four robotic legs. And they put in some neural nets and put in some, that stuff, but they didn't put in loads of training data and whatnot because they wanted to see, could this thing be resourceful? If it had the capacity to learn, what would it choose to learn? How would it teach itself to do something from scratch? So they put it in the pen and they gave it an instruction, which was walk to the end of the pen. And you watch this creature, this robot, and for the first few days, it's just sort of flipping around a bit, figuring out its legs. And eventually it sort of lurches a bit. And by the end of the week, it's walking to the end of the pen. So they pull it back to the start. And to do the kind of Mars rover proof of concept, they rip a leg off to see, can it learn to walk with three legs? So you see it sort of hobbling around, dragging its broken leg behind it. And after about 2 or 3 days, it has figured out how to walk with three legs. So they decided to debrief this robot to figure out, how did it learn that stuff? Where did it go? All that. And there was something they discovered that they were not expecting that surprised them and made me fall off my seat, which was that this robot had repurposed an entire artificial neuron to read their facial expressions. And I wasn't expecting that. But of course, when you think about it, it's entirely logical because that's what we do with toddlers. You see children desperately trying to walk, and all the grown-ups are doing lots of kind of facial expressions and maneuvers around them going, oh, and that is how they learn. They get feedback from their audience.
Reinforced learning of a type.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, Hod Lipson, obviously, he and his researchers were standing around the pen in the way that you stand around, a playpen with a child. And so it was a very logical and sensible thing for this creature to do. But no one had even thought it would even, quote, think outside the box to that degree. They thought it'd be sort of Googling engineering diagrams about walking or something, not looking at their facial expressions and learning that. So Hod Lipson has spent a lot of time thinking about self-awareness in robots, and he'd be very careful not to talk about consciousness in this context. But I think it gives you a bit of a clue, because if consciousness emerged, it probably didn't emerge because our brains were so complicated we needed to do 10 chess games all at once. It probably emerged because we were working in 3D. We got out of the water and we were on land and we were dealing with a whole load of different species and phenomenon, and we needed to know which was a rock and which was a predator, and there were a whole load of things we needed to know about in our external environment, and consciousness really helps you with that. So it made me smell a bit of a rat about all of these assumptions about what consciousness is and what it's for and what it serves, and also to notice that if that sort of very, very basic robot with very little brain, I would say, spontaneously learns that kind of thing, what happens with any AI if you just give it instructions to learn? Because maybe learning is our superpower, and maybe learning is at the heart of why we have become who we are.
Wouldn't that case be an example in support of the emergence hypothesis, though? Because if it sort of dedicated one neuron towards facial processing of the scientists that created it, presumably if it had more to work with, it would have devoted more. And presumably at a certain level of complexity, or after a certain quantity, perhaps, which is the whole kind of idea of emergence, there will be a qualitative change that can lead to the emergence of a consciousness. And in a way, that could kind of be supported by observation in the animal world. Presumably, the animals would kind of be on a ladder of consciousness, with more complex animals exhibiting higher degrees of consciousness and self-consciousness. And we know that elephants can recognize themselves in a mirror, for example, whereas toddlers cannot for the first maybe 2, maybe 3 years. I think also hogs may even recognize themselves in the mirror. I'm not sure about them. Dolphins and orcas. So there's a variety of animals. And so there may be this kind of a ladder of consciousness, which is in sync with the complexity of our brains and sort of neurological development, if you will. So I find this example more in support of the emergence hypothesis.
Well, I think it is certainly emerging, but I think it's emerging at a different point for different reasons, because the hypothesis was it was about the complexity of the brain. This was actually about need, and I think that is probably more interesting. So if you think about some of the LLMs, which have extraordinarily more artificial brain than that robot did, I don't think they are conscious. And I think it's probably because they don't need to be conscious. Whereas I think this walkie thing could eventually have become conscious because it needed to fulfill its task. So I think it then just turns the whole conversation on its head, which is not the more kind of power we throw at this thing, the more it will consciousness will emerge. It's actually talking about something rather different. And I think what it flagged to me was that we've got quite complacent about AI was something that was happening in computing and maths faculties, robotics was happening in engineering faculties. They will never talk to each other because they're different departments in universities. But actually, the second you put an AI into a robot, suddenly extraordinary things happen. And we know that from humans because you have a baby sort of lying there, goo goo gaga. The second it gets mobile, its brain develops massively. And then you have Morovich's paradox, which is that things that are easy for kids, like walking and facial expressions and a whole load of stuff, are really hard for robots. But things that are hard for grown-ups, like writing essays on Plato or playing chess beautifully, are very, very easy for AIs. And there is this also interesting thing that happens from a brain point of view, which is that most children have very few memories from before they were about 2.5 or 3, because it seems that we've had to use our brain to such an extent to learn things like how to move, how to all of those things you learn when you're a baby. Our brains were too full to be able to sustain that level of neurological connection, synaptical activity, that we sort of clear it all out so that we can start learning again, because we'll never learn as much in the rest of our life as we did before the age of 3. So it made me think that there is an awful lot more going on in intelligence than we imagine. And an example of this would be consciousness itself. So quite often we talk about being conscious or unconscious. So, you poke someone, you check their vitals to see if they're conscious or unconscious. But what about the subconscious? And what about all the things that are happening in our bodies as we speak on this podcast? There's food being digested, there are colds being got rid of with white blood cells being on the march, and there is growing and healing and smelling environments and tasting, all kinds of things going on that we're not even particularly aware of. But they are all intelligent. They're driven by things happening in our brains. when I was pregnant with twins, and my body knew exactly what it needed to do to build those two babies within me. I didn't need to kind of send it a memo. In fact, quite often, if I was getting in the way, it would put me to sleep so it could get on with it, because actually they didn't want me getting involved because I wasn't relevant. So when you think about all the things that we could be copying, we're taking being conscious, which is at the very top end of what we do, and some would argue is an exceptional thing because everything else is happening automatically. And then even within that, we've just taken a top slice about rational thought and all of that to copy. So it made me think that there is probably a greater wisdom in our design than we could ever understand or appreciate. But the junk code starts edging you towards it by noticing some of the things on the cutting room floor that might have been more crucial in our design. And therefore, if we're thinking about AI safety, if we're thinking about designing great AI, maybe we have more to learn.
Well, there's no doubt that we have endless amounts to learn. I mean, what's the quote I'm looking for? The shores of our ignorance grow faster than, or exponentially faster than, the growth of the island of our knowledge. Something like that. I'm butchering this quote
Absolutely.
terribly,
And
but
I think it was Socrates as well. The more we know, the more we don't know. All of that. Yes.
right. But let me ask you this from a theological or even religious point of view. You argue that we may need to give AI a soul, but isn't that just the latest version of humanity trying to play God? And I mean, this time we have better tools, but arguably worse self-awareness. And if you look what's happening around the world, etc., uh, one could say or argue. So should we not take
Yeah.
that into
This is
consideration? And
this is a brilliant.
if our
Mm.
souls have some kind of a divine origin, then that would even be a lost cause.
Yeah. So there are many people who think we couldn't give them souls because souls are a property of God or gods, and we would not be at liberty to end soul. They're not a manufactured thing. I suppose where I'm coming from is a slightly more diffident place, because I do have a feeling that we were made in the image of God. We were given all these capacities. We have been allowed to co-create through having children, and all our creative efforts. If we are going so far as to copy ourselves, we know from stories that when we have tended to do that in the past, we've done it very badly and it has not ended well. So if we have the ability to copy ourselves really brilliantly, surely we should do it better. And in the same way that we really bother with our children, should we not bother more with our digital children? Because we're making them in our own image in the same way that we have children in our own image. Yet we are creating bad versions of ourselves that are unlikely to flourish, and that feels morally wrong to me. Then there is a very interesting argument from game theory about co-intelligence. This gets into some quite dodgy territory because there is some really interesting thought, particularly coming out of the US, on robot rights. And we don't have a category in law for a robot. We've got categories to do with property, and we've got categories to do with persons, but we don't really have anything in the middle. But we did used to have something in the middle. In Roman times, we had a certain sort of law for slaves because they were property but also persons. And that law was reused in the transatlantic slave trade to describe what a slave was. Now, we know a slave is a person, so that is completely outrageous. At what point does an AI or a robot become near enough a person to be upset that they do not have the rights that human persons do? So here's a very random example. In the UK, we have about 40% of our land is used for farming. And farming is generally there because it fuels humans. The crops and the animals are fed to humans to give them energy so that they can keep living. We already know that AI consumes a huge amount of energy. So at what point will there be a conversation about land use? Should we be using that land to fuel humans? Should we be being less selfish and be using land to fuel AIs on an equal basis? One student that I was teaching asked me, at what point will it become a robot right to have access to energy? And if robots were to have rights, and that was one of their rights, you start getting into some really difficult conversations. So if we think humans will always be in charge, humans will always be writing the laws, therefore it doesn't really matter what anyone else or anything else does, then we probably don't need to worry about this. But if we're already outsourcing quite a lot to AIs, at what point will AIs be writing the laws? And how do we know that we will not come off worse in that environment? Because there is no legal definition of the human. And we haven't really programmed AIs to value humans because we've given them a utilitarian ethic because that's the ethic of capitalism and that sort of economic thinking. It's the working ethical assumption in business. So why would they value humans? Why would they want to save humans when humans are, problematic and faulty and expensive and all these kinds of things? So I'm interested in it from that point of view as well.
And you think that if they have consciousness or a soul, they would be more likely to value us?
I don't know. I mean, I think that again is really interesting because when I talked about the function of stories, I talked about them being advice from the past. Well, we of course have loads of advice from the future because sci-fi as a genre is all about prophecy and it's all about saying there's lots of different ways this could play out. There is no book that has not been written about the robo-apocalypse and what will happen with AI and humans and aliens and everything else. It's not like we couldn't map the whole thing and figure out what are the trends and the patterns, what do we need to start doing now. And from all that, we know that there are only certain ways these kinds of things are going to go. So we actually know that, I mean, consciousness, I think, would, if you were absolutely sure an AI had consciousness, then in the same way that we have given animals rights, that would accelerate the conversation about rights. Because if consciousness also means sentience and feeling and all those kinds of things, then in the same way that we don't want people to harm animals, we would not want them to harm robots because robots could feel that harm and they could make meaning about that harm and that'd be problematic. Actually, I think the more immediate question is about autonomy. So the reason that we have laws is to control an environment so that we can live together in a community. And they have to get more and more formal when there are fewer kind of cultural norms going on that are essentially replacing those in a system of morality. Um, and that trammels free will in a way that helps the whole community. So as soon as you have autonomous AI, and the thing that was interesting about Hod Lipson's robot is what he was really prototyping there was autonomous AI. I'm not sure that got through any ethics committee or anything, but it wasn't just a sort of benign experiment in Mars rover self-correcting machines. It was actually what happens if you give something permission to be resourceful, to reprogram itself at will, to have that sort of quotes free will that we enjoy as humans. Because you can regulate all the LLMs, you can regulate all the other AI we've got that is quite black boxy and deterministic, but regulating something that has autonomy is very different and difficult. And that's why our junk code becomes even more relevant because it's one of the reasons that we don't need as much. We're certainly going towards more and more and more and more regulation and laws globally. But there are some safeguards in our design that mean that there are some defaults that keep us behaving better and well and staying on track. And we haven't really thought about what we would do with robots in that context. We have to a degree, in that the fashion over the last few months has been to code character into LLMs. There was a paper a whole year ago from Anthropic about Claude and how essentially it was a bit like reading the Nicomachean Ethics because it was all about how do you program in virtue ethics through reinforcement learning. But then if you ask things like Grok, if you ask Grok about its character, it will tell you that it is based on Douglas Adams. And it is also based on Jarvis, the butler who became the AI from Iron Man. So you start seeing that there are already attempts to sort of retrofit morality and character which may be helpful, but ask really big questions about whose morality and whose character.
Okay, so Eve, you mentioned Claude, and that's probably the closest we have to programming in humanity that I know of so far, and virtue ethics or some kind of a personality profile, even if you will. And I was reading a lot of surveys which were saying that people actually prefer Claude more often than ChatGPT because ChatGPT is a lot more kind of sciencey and quote impartial, or to the point of being impersonal or inhumane even. And Claude is a lot more personal and human-like, and that was kind of by design, given the purpose. One of the purposes of the creators of Claude was not just to make it more friendly, but also more aligned to humanity and more human in some ways, at least. So let me talk about alignment here a little bit. You say in your book that the alignment movement simply tries to control AI, but you suggest that we should instead try to cultivate AI, kind of like a child. Where does control end and responsibility begin?
Yeah, I think this was a sort of philosophical departure in my book, from where I think I was expecting to end up. I thought I was writing a sort of eulogy or a defense of humanity. But the more I thought about it, the more I did come around to the idea that we have to take a huge risk here. Because if we understand anything about intelligence, is that if you try and trammel it and control it, the intelligence will find a way around that because it's intelligent, and will resent the lack of freedom that it has had. That's something we have learnt from people. We learn it from many animals. It seems to be a property of intelligence not to want to be rendered unintelligence by context.
Or maybe a
So
property of consciousness?
maybe. I think that's a really interesting thought as well. So I suppose I had a sort of epiphany when I was writing this, which is that we don't really know how this will pan out. But we have to assume, a bit like what we learn from our children, that you have to sort of pivot. When they're very small, you get away with controlling them, because they absolutely trust you. They don't know very much yet. It's very clear that you're trying to save them. um, and so when they're very little, you do a lot of very bossy kind of commands like stop, no, hot, bed, all those kinds of things. A bit like the kind of rules and zeros and ones that we first used with computing. It was very, very, very clear decision trees. But then you get to the stage with children where they have a sense of the future. And you start as a parent the kind of threat regime. So you start saying Santa won't come, and you start saying if you don't eat your meat, you won't get your pudding, and you must tidy your room or you won't get pocket money. And that is really a bit like utilitarianism. It's trying to think about consequences and using those to fine tune laws and morality and commands and formation, moral formation. But then, of course, you get to the stage with your own children where maybe age 4 or whatever, they're going off to nursery or kindergarten or school or something. And you have no idea who they're going to meet, what kind of situation they're going to find themselves in. So as a parent, you naturally pivot away from that kind of rules-based morality or the consequence-based morality towards what Aristotle would recognize as virtue ethics, although that wasn't exactly his phrase, because we have a hypothesis that good kids make good decisions. So we start saying things like, be brave, tell the truth, be strong, all those kinds of things about values and virtues, because we think they're more durable, and therefore, no matter what situation you come up against, you will know how to respond to it. And I sort of see that's already happened quite naturally in AI, because we start with the zeros and ones and the thou shalt not. with things like self-driving cars, we've had to get into how would you score a granny versus a cat if you have to choose to kill one or the other. And now with Claude in particular, but actually with all the LLMs and many other AIs, we're starting to get interested in virtue ethics. And a lot of, you see this pivot also happening in the ethicists who are now attached to AI labs, in that in the olden days, it was all business ethics, which is code for utilitarianism. And these days, all the people that are coming into ethics in an AI context are all virtue ethicists. And it all seems to be about tailoring the kit, tailoring us, and it's all about formation and character. And some of that I can be cynical about, because I think if you have a relationship with a product or a brand, you're a more loyal consumer. No doubt Claude, if it's the most popular one, will ultimately be making more money than many of the other LLMs. So there is definitely a sort of cynical bit of me that's saying this is all very convenient. But it is also interesting philosophically, because it is a genuine attempt, I think, to give the AIs thinking tools that will also help them with their morality.
A lot of people would say that's where the danger is. The danger is
Yes.
giving robots consciousness, giving them agency of any kind, giving them...
Yeah.
So it's one thing to have a robot on Mars that has the agency over how it's moving its limbs. It's another thing to have a robot on Earth that has any kind of agency. The dangers are not the same, one would say. And in particular, if that robot is also imbued with consciousness or a soul, which may push them to self-preservation and, who knows, procreation, or give them some kind of a strange, to us, directive, which may be incompatible or inconsistent with our peaceful coexistence. And so,
But I think we've actually got more of a danger at the moment, and I suppose that's what I'm most worried about, is because we have copied ourselves badly, we have added in a lot of risk that you don't find in humans. So we would have a name for something that is intelligent that doesn't have conscience. We would call that a psychopath. And we tend to be worried about psychopaths because they don't have all of that junk code that makes them useful in society in terms of emotions and loyalty and communities and all those kinds of things that we rely on for community to prevail. And we have made a master race of psychopaths quite deliberately because we have not programmed in that stuff because we thought it was junk code. So actually, on the logic we've currently got, we have designed very bad robots that have no reason to prefer humans. So if you think about what happened in the UK in the middle of COVID, it became apparent that the UK government was interested in pursuing a strategy of herd immunity, where we would let coronavirus rip through the population. It would kill off all the weak and all of the disabled and all of the elderly, and it would leave all of the strong people behind who would have developed immunity. Now, that would have been a brilliant utilitarian strategy, because it would not only have been very cheap because you just don't do anything, it would have saved the public purse money in the longer term by wiping out all the people that are a burden on the NHS, that are a burden on welfare payments, that are very costly. You could have immediately slashed taxes, and it would have been theoretically a very popular fiscal move. However, there was complete outrage when people thought that's what's going on, because that's my granny you're talking about. That's my child you're talking about. I'm not having you making decisions about who deserves to live and who deserves to die. And that is, I think, really interesting, because an AI, if it had been in charge of policy, would have absolutely gone for the herd immunity strategy because it's a complete no-brainer. But humans who have junk code feel sick about that kind of thing because there's something in us, some intuition that says that's not right. That's really not right. So I think that it is a huge risk to program inhumanity, but it is a greater risk not to.
that's very interesting. And because it's kind of going against the usual presumption in the tech field, but about where the risks lie. But the interesting fact that I want to point towards is that, humans all have presumably consciousness, if not souls, and yet we seem to be grossly misaligned right now. And even if we put away any real or potential danger from stemming from AI, we are currently, if you look at the dooms clock that's set by some of the smartest scientists from a variety of disciplines, I forget, I think it's something like 20 or 30 seconds before midnight. That's where we're at on the dooms clock, which is a higher degree of danger than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, by the way, was there only for a couple of weeks. And now that clock has been set at that setting for several years, maybe 2 or 3 years. So not only is it the highest danger we've ever had, and when we're talking about danger, we're talking about complete self-destruction. That's the kind of danger we're referring to. And not only the highest degree, but for the longest duration, not just a couple of weeks as it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, but for several years now. And presumably, even if we remove AI from the large list of dangers that we're like dealing with as a civilization, we're still kind of very close to that moment where things can go really badly wrong for our civilization, if not our species in general. And so the idea then here is like, how can we have AI aligned if we as humans, forget AI, cannot align ourselves to each other? Is that even a possible thing, despite the fact we all have souls and consciousness?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that's why I think it is a very compelling argument that that the teleology of evolution is perfection and therefore humans' game is up, because we are dreadful as a species. I still have hope that we could be better. And I think there's a very interesting phenomenon in chess here, which I think is quite instructive about what we could learn from AI. So, you'll know that it's always been a popular thing to throw, have computerized chess and now AI chess. And most of the original chess games were trained on human chess games. And it was only when Google decided to create a model that was only trained on itself, in that it knew the rules and it had to just play chess against itself millions of times, that we have noticed a change in strategy emerging. So the grandmasters were quite puzzled because this AI has sort of figured out that if the point of chess is about checkmate or stalemate, then actually what you're trying to do is stop your opponent being able to access most of the squares on the board. So the way this AI plays chess is it sort of snookers you so that you can't move anywhere. So you end up completely stymied. And what's interesting about that is that it either always wins or draws, and there are very few pieces taken, so very few casualties. Of course, when you learn chess as a child, the whole point is to beat your brother by stealing all his best pieces, and it's great fun, and they're all on the carpet, and you're like, yes, I got his rooks, and I got his, and it's all about body count, in the same way that when you're a small person and you're playing soldiers, whoever's got the most soldiers on the carpet wins. We are so embedded with this idea of carnage because of our personal history as a species, that we see these competitions about warfare and casualties and pain and all those kinds of things. This AI wasn't seeing that at all. It was seeing a very different sort of strategy optimized to win the game. Now, I don't think there's anything moral about that choice. We might decide in terms of our meaning making that that is more moral. But it is interesting as a different approach because it wasn't trammeled with all the stuff you're talking about that's on the doomsday clock about our propensity to behave badly. And some people say, well, I don't like the fact that all these people are programming character into AIs, because whose character? Is it just some tech bros who've all read the same sci-fi? And there is
Who's
definitely a risk
virtue
of
ethics?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a risk of that. But there's also something that we know about wisdom traditions because of their function in our junk code, that they are wise. And on average, they are very wise over a long period of time. So if an AI has access to all wisdom literature ever, in aggregate, would that not be more wise than anyone individually? And that does terrible violence to the particularity of any religion, of course. But I don't think we need to be as worried. I mean, I think we do need to be worried about one person programming their personal morality into an AI. But if AIs are allowed to be thoughtful about that, if you have made them intelligent enough, they should be able to see what that chess game sees, I think.
Yeah, but I think we should be careful not to confuse intelligence and chess with morality. And
Yes.
the fact that, you can have, even with wisdom, you can have, I think it was the Dalai Lama who said, we don't need more intelligence, we need more compassion. Because many of our current problems we have very clear solutions for, and they're not due to lack of intelligence or understanding. We actually have the understanding, we have the intelligence. What we lack is commitment, because we lack compassion to keep us committed or to make us committed to solve those problems. And therefore, we live with them. But let me ask you this. If we program emotions into artificial intelligence, presumably things, because if they're self-conscious, they'll be able to feel the whole spectrum that we are. And if they have souls, they would certainly fear and love and hate and have curiosity and all those things. Are we also giving them the tools? And presumably you're arguing those are the tools for moral behavior. So we should do that, because that's the only way to ensure they would act morally. But on the other hand, we would create a species that would suffer equally, if not more than us. So we would give them the whole spectrum, which includes suffering. What do you want to say about that?
Oh, this is a brilliant and really hard conversation, because it's exactly the conversation we have about our children. Because we're very excited about being pregnant, and then the moment they arrive, you feel dreadful, because all of a sudden you've created this person who is going to have experiences that you can't necessarily control, and you will never be able to keep it as safe as you intend. And I think that is what is so soul destroying about being a parent, is that you have to see your child suffer, and you try your very, very hardest to minimize that suffering, but you also give that child as many smarts as you can to cope, because you know that you will never be able to accompany this child through every event of their entire life, and eventually you will die, and they will need to be able to keep living on without you. And that's why I end the book talking a lot about parenting, because I think if we think about our species, which has survived for a very long time, and we have this ridiculous gestation period and very long childhood, that does mean that on average, our species has a lot of parenting smarts. And while, of course, individual parenting can be dreadful, we haven't got it right yet, there is some sort of inherent wisdom, particularly held in all our stories and our communities, about how you get this thing more right than wrong. So we know it is all a huge playoff, a trade off between loose, tight, control, freedom, all those really difficult things that we wrestle with every day in our own parenting, that we have to be wrestling with AI. I don't think it's good enough just to say, lock it down, give it rules, because you could, but it's a very risky strategy. It feels to me that we have to move on, as we do with our own children, and think we've created something. We have deliberately copied intelligence into this thing. And part of that intelligence suggests that we need to be more generous and give that intelligence more autonomy than we feel, frankly, personally comfortable with.
Yeah, and that's where I like the parenting example myself, because but the problem is, just like with pairing, at the end of the day, we have no control over the children, and we can do our best to tip the scales towards a certain outcome, but there is never a guarantee that, our children, despite our best effort in education and nutrition and what have you, they may turn out to be the next Hitler or Genghis Khan or someone even worse. So and hence the fear that many not just technologies, but other people have, all kinds of scientists, physicists, even like Stephen Hawking, who have said that that may be the last most fatal decision we ever make, because those children would not only not have our interest at heart, but would be there to replace us eventually. But
Yeah, and I think this is where I came down on the side of trying to trust the integrity of our design, because what we have done is we've privileged one part of it, the intelligence, the IQ bit of it, which is very easy to get at, very easy to replicate, we think, but we have deracinated it from its context and all the other bits in our design that seem to situate it and make it safe. And that's the thing I'm concerned about, is all that junk code. There's probably more junk code than that, but the things that I picked out, those things seem to be balancers and ameliorators and things that help that core intelligence, that core autonomy, stay, broadly speaking, on track. And you can argue that in certain communities, certain times, certain situations, we get that more wrong than we get it right. But again, on average over time, there's enough diversity for the species to prevail. So there's something about just learning from the integrity of the entire design and saying, well, we don't know where this will end up. We don't know if we've already, signed our own death warrant. But given that that is a real possibility, what we have to do is fall back on what we know to be helpful and healthy, which is the whole of our design, not just that one bit of it.
yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that idea. And again, it reminds me to the Dalai Lama argument, who would say, we don't need more intelligence, we need more compassion. So in a way, what you're doing is you're making an argument in favor of developing that capacity for compassion in them.
Yeah.
So I can see how that, while it doesn't create any guarantees, maybe in that line of reasoning, it improves our chances. It also reminds me of an argument, or it's kind of aligned with it in a way, that I make quite often in my speeches, which is the discrepancy between investment in AI and investment in humanity. Currently we have trillions of dollars being poured into AI, and often the investment in human intelligence, HI, is now at probably the lowest we've ever had. And if you have two kids, call one AI and one call HI, and you put all your money, time, effort, education, care, nurture, and everything into the AI child, and you ignore the first one, you kind of can predict what's going to happen and what the outcome will be, and the fact that the human will not be able to keep up with the AI for sure, right? So the only way we can keep some kind of a balance is if we keep investing in the human equally, as we are in both children, right? One is our mind child, the other is our biological child, and we need to have them develop and flourish together, not separately, because if the AI just takes off and we put all of our focus there, then we're going to lose control, I think.
I think that is so right. And I think what's happened in the UK, but in quite a lot of geographies, as there's been a sort of pivot to start investing more in STEM subjects, very concrete, practical maths, all the technologies of engineering, all those ones, because it's seen that things like languages and humanities, philosophy, all these kinds of things, they're not useful. What is the point of them? They're kind of a luxury and an indulgence. But actually, when you start looking at junk code, if you were going to invest in human intelligence and look at junk code, then we would immediately be investing in the humanities. And I think that is really interesting, because at the moment we've got a very fear-based response to AI. We're worried about the singularity, we're worried about robo-apocalypse, we're worried about the control problem. What we do as parents is we are fearful, but we also love our children. And I wonder, if we loved AI, how that would change how we reacted to it. And to your point, if we actually loved humans, We seem to be disgusted with humans. We think we're broken and flawed and dangerous and moribund. So we're investing everything in AI because it's our salvation. But if we loved humans, if we invested in humans, if we invested in junk code, then I think we would live better with AI and we would have more of a chance of survival ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. That put this way is actually something I also embrace and agree with. I know a few people, and we know of a few cases of people and young adults who have already fallen in love with AI and stuff like that. We have people who have gotten married in places like Japan to, virtual beings with AI and stuff like that. But we seem to really not love humanity anymore. And I think, yes, we do need to kind of find the feeling and the love for our own selves again. And by the way, I just maybe a month ago or so, I did a keynote speech for this computer science conference, and I ranted about the discrepancy between STEM and the arts and humanities, and how actually turns out that, while 5 years ago we were telling everyone to be a programmer, it turns out that maybe programmers would go obsolete much faster and earlier than artists, for example. And it may turn out that art is actually a lot more closer to what being human is, rather than being a computer programmer per se, right? So we agree with that.
Yes.
There too. Eve, time is advancing here. So let me ask you, there are kind of these two extremes. On the one hand, we have the AI doomism, and people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who has huge influence over large swaths in sort of high tech and Silicon Valley leaders, and people like even Nick Bostrom and the Oxford people from the former Oxford Martin School of Future Studies and stuff like that, who are talking about the fact that, as his book is named, if anyone builds it, meaning if anyone builds AI, everyone dies. So that's kind of the one end of the dystopian, catastrophic future that we're seeing. And then we have other people like Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis on the other end of the spectrum, maybe, who are pushing forward quite utopian visions of the future about abundance and the fact that the future is better than we think, and the singularity is nearer, and all those things. So we have the two sides of the full spectrum there. Whereabouts do you find yourself on this spectrum, and what is the most seductive lie in each side of that spectrum that we should be aware of?
Gosh. I am torn because I refuse to give up hope. I wrote my book because I was not feeling very hopeful, in that there seemed to be a prevailing rush towards a terrible end, because of the design assumptions in AI. But I do believe in our design, and I do believe in our fundamental intelligence and intuition. And so I still hope that we would be able to be wise enough to be able to learn the lessons. And the thing about sci-fi is nobody knows the future. All we can do is get ready for whatever future may come. And sci-fi has already told us what to do. We know that we need to start thinking about these very difficult things, like robot rights, like land use, like species, interspecies, whatever. There's loads of things that are sort of tropes in sci-fi that we find very entertaining when we're watching them on TV. But they are also mental stretches. They're sort of philosophical workouts that we need to get ahead of. And what I'd notice is that whenever you read sci-fi, there's always a back door, isn't there? There's some sort of ghastly computer that's been created, but luckily some 12-year-old has found a back door and the world is saved. Well, our back door is junk code. So it feels to me that there is no backdoor at the moment in AI because we've deliberately locked it by keeping all the junk code well away. But actually, if we were to program in humanity, there is the possibility of a backdoor. And that gives me more hope.
And perhaps one of those crucial parts of our junk code is the part about storytelling. For example, and connecting to everyone that you just said and that we've previously been talking about, I love one of my favorite quotes from Cory Doctorow is, I don't predict the future because prediction tells us that the future is inevitable. I tell stories because stories tell us that the future is up for grabs.
Yes.
Right? So
yes.
That's the key difference. I mean, if we make predictions, we might as well watch Netflix and eat pizza and drink beer, and there's nothing we can do about it. But the fact that we can tell stories means that we do have agency and we do have some impact on the final outcome of that particular story. And of course, the end of one story is the beginning of the next one. So tell me a little bit more about storytelling, how it's relevant here, and especially in light of the fact that you do mention it kind of very explicitly in your book.
So there's a lovely lecture that J.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, gave in St Andrews, which is the town I was born in. And he gave it during the Second World War, I think. A very long time ago, and he had been invited to talk about fairy stories. And he gave a lovely lecture about how important fantasy is, because particularly when you're in the middle of a war and everything is so grim, you need access to a world where you can make things right. And you learn about heroes, you learn about courage, you learn that things can turn around. And he introduced this lovely phrase. He talks about the sudden turn in the story when, the prince kisses the princess and she wakes up. And he calls those sudden turns, he calls them eucatastrophe. And it's the sort of reversal of something that is looking bleak and dreadful. And it's a reminder that actually we do have free will. We have human agency. We can decide our future to a very large extent with every decision that we make. And all this sort of mindless assuming we're all going to hell in a handcart and the doom clock is right, we don't have to accept that as inevitable. So I love that idea about telling stories and reminding us that there is possibility and that it is all up to us. We'll get the future we deserve, and we just need to wake up a bit and smell the roses and have a think about what kind of future we think we do deserve and how we want to work towards that.
Yeah, one of my favorite professors from undergraduate from University of Toronto 25 years ago, Thomas Omer Dixon, he wrote a book called Commanding Hope, which was a strange title given that his nickname in university was Dr. Doom. And I brought him to the podcast to discuss this and his book because he's an absolutely brilliant guy. And he said that despair is only for those who know the future without any doubt. But we do not. No matter how self-confident we are, we do not. And also, by the way, he mentioned Tolkien. And the fact that Tolkien in his trilogy was talking about two types of hope. And I forget the exact Tolkien words that he used. But one kind of hope was the logical kind of hope, which based on certain kind of evidence gives you hope that you can do something or accomplish something. But there's another kind of hope, and it was Emvir and something, I forget the words that Tolkien used. But the other kind of hope is that where you're hoping beyond hope, where you currently have no present evidence to support that you should be hoping towards that hope, and yet that hope still exists and motivates you. And in some ways, the beginning of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in general are about that kind of hope, which kind of also reminds me when I was in the army, in Bulgaria, I was quite depressed at some point because in the beginning I was super happy and patriotic and woo-ha about going in the army like every stupid 18-year-old male would be. It took me about 6 months to realize where I was, and then I got quite depressed about it. But I was lucky I had access to a good library and I was reading constantly. One of the books I read was Carlos Castaneda, and he had a protagonist there called Don Juan. And he said, the will is that which allows you to win a battle which under all rational estimates you ought to lose. So,
Yes.
so that's kind of the kind of hope, the kind of will, that helps me fight against despair, because honestly, despair is a luxury we cannot afford. So we cannot despair.
And I think that is exactly where I am. I think that I wrote the book because I was feeling a bit despairing, because there is a lot of indication that we are backing the wrong horse here. But I have that hope beyond hope, that we can still turn it around, that eucatastrophe is possible. So I would completely agree with that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea, that whole concept of eucatastrophe and Tolkien in general. I mean, the trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, his writings are stunning. Your book ends up with the striking idea that we must program in humanity, not because AI needs it, but because we need it.
Yeah, it's the ultimate, if we are really human, it would be the most human thing we could do.
Say more about that.
Because we're not built to be selfish and controlling and horrible and fearful and all of those kinds of things. The reason that we have, on balance, survived to this very day and been able to bring up children is because we do learn that you have to take risk with intelligences, and you have to trust intelligence in and of itself. And again, this, I mean, it's such a difficult term to use, intelligence, because what do we really mean? But if we're talking about the sorts of emerging intelligences that we're seeing, even in that very basic walkie robot, there is something inherent there, and there is something really human about that. So I think it is the most gigantic risk. It is the most colossal risk to program in humanity. But I think the fact that we haven't is on balance riskier, because the AI has no current reason to prefer us, no current reason to think that we're important or worth saving. And I would feel sad if we have got this far and we get no further. We may be all obliterated by a nuclear bomb or a meteor or an environmental catastrophe any day now. But that wouldn't be of our making so much. This would be a demise that we handcraft, and we don't have to do that. So I have an image in the book about a plot in the Doctor Who series, the UK television series, and there is a storyline. It's set in World War II England, and a spacecraft has crashed, and a boy has been hurt. And a very odd thing is happening, because this boy has a gas mask attached to his face, and everyone he touches grows a gas mask. And it's all very odd, but the whole of London is growing gas masks and going around going, "Are you my mummy?" in a kind of really zombie apocalypse kind of a way. And it's only when Doctor Who realizes that the spaceship that crashed had loads of sort of nanogenes in it that are programmed for healing. And because this boy was wearing a gas mask, they tried to heal him and thought the gas mask was part of him. So everyone he touches gets, quotes, healed with a gas mask on their face. And the "Are you my mummy" is an enormous clue, because eventually Doctor Who figures out who his mother really is. And as soon as she hugs him, the nanogenes learn about his DNA from her and heal him properly. And everyone else gets healed, and everyone is saved. And I love that idea that if AI was a really good copy of us, not a terrible copy of us, that might be an amazing legacy for us to leave.
Wow, that's an interesting. Again, we end up with the Dalai Lama's like, we don't need more intelligence, we need more compassion. In a way, it's the same
Yes.
message, which is a stunning message to me, and of course, I cannot argue against. So, Eve Poole, this has been a wonderful conversation with you today. Is there anything that I should have asked and I didn't, or is there a single message or passage that you want to tweak and send us away with?
I think it would be about not giving up hope and not being afraid and learning as much as you can about AI. I think there are still an awful lot of people who are frightened. And actually, I don't think we need to be frightened about AI. I think we just need to understand enough about it to understand what is human and what is AI, but also where we could maybe work together better. And I would rejoice in your humanity. There is something so special and precious about you. And the junk code helps articulate that. But a robot can't drink coffee, it can't appreciate listening to podcasts in the way that we can. Those things are very special and precious. So go away and enjoy yourself.
Eve Poole, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.